So this is the first in a new series of talks hosted by the Association of Irish Composers. Thanks to Roasted Brown for hosting us here. I want to first of all explain why I invited these two panellists to join us today. And then I'm going to ask them, by way of introduction, to explain why they accepted. Raymond, if you could say what led you to accept the invitation to speak today?
Well, I'm a very obliging person. I don't like to refuse people anything, ever. I think, wanted, my initial reaction was that I wanted to deliver a diatribe about this whole idea of edgy venues. We're probably sitting in one here now,
yes.
Which means that I have to raise my voice in an unnatural way, and I'm being distracted all the time by somebody talking in a loud voice downstairs. Which is fine. I mean, this isn't a concert. But also, you sent me a letter in which you made some assertions. You mentioned my writing concertos and things, and you refer to classical forms. The fact that you write a piece and call it a concerto doesn't mean you're writing in a classical form. Probably, if I were writing those pieces again, the oboe concerto and the violin concerto, I might have given them different titles. I don't believe I work within classical forms. I work upon classical forms, maybe, but not necessarily within them.
And Sebastian, why have you agreed to do this?
Again, I'm very obliging, but I suppose what made this an interesting thing to discuss right now is that I think we're at an interesting point in the music scene, particularly in Dublin, which is primarily based around edgy venues, not necessarily entirely by choice. Is sort of springing up and beginning to actually draw audiences which they're not big by the standards of symphony orchestra audiences, but they're a lot bigger than the audiences that were coming even 2 or 3 years ago to contemporary music concerts.
Given how raucous and varied in their programming and in audience engagement the early classical concerts were, and how the format we've inherited today deliberately aspired to be exclusive and to exclude people. Is it still the best place to hear new music today? Is that format still a relevant and appropriate place for new music to be performed?
I certainly feel excluded from a lot of venues because I know that my particular way of listening is not going to be respected. I feel that there may be an exclusionary dimension about the kind of music that is going to be presented, that it is going to be a music that suits the venue, and therefore lots of music is going to be excluded from that. And I agree with you that the concert format and the whole setup in concert halls does smack of a certain nostalgia for a particular kind of exclusiveness. And also, for example, the way the orchestra dresses. And soloists. Why do you have to wear these monkey suits? You know, it's more suited for a funeral or something, and that inhibits a lot of people from turning up to these things, and it gives the wrong impression because I don't see that music as funereal. I don't see it as hugely formal. I mean, the music that probably most people here love, I think, can be presented really in any kind of venue. By all means, devise different environments and cultures to suit those differences. Change concert hall practice, but there are very good reasons why a concert hall that has been built to purpose, that in theory has got the proper acoustic conditions for, let's say, listening to chamber music or orchestra music or so on, should be an appropriate venue for listening to that music and for listening to it quietly. But this whole question, to me, it's a question of attention and it's a question of concentration. And I'm very much worried that we're seeing trends that are directed towards belittling and demeaning the concept of attentiveness, the concept of concentration. Somebody pointed out to me an article in the New York Times last year by an American philosopher I'd never heard of called Michael B. Crawford, which is called The Cost of Paying Attention, which he says, attention is a resource. A person has only so much of it, and yet we've auctioned off more and more of our public space to private commercial interests. Just as keen air makes it possible to breathe, silence makes it possible to think. And I would paraphrase that, silence makes it possible to listen. to listen to music that is composed with a view to that kind of listening.
Perhaps you're suggesting that there's a benefit to this. Maybe we've inherited this tradition due to other cultural factors, but it has given us the gift of attentive listening, which hadn't existed before, and it might be a shame to lose that or to risk. It's something worth keeping.
Yeah, I do think that. Yeah.
Well, probably from my point of view, most music could benefit from a quiet space where no one will applaud or talk during the piece. But I think for a lot of smaller events, there's no need for a stage. A lot of my music is for small groups, which certainly doesn't need a large room. I suppose the most notable thing that Kirkos have done in an unusual venue is the Blackout series, which we did over the summer, which a lot of people here would have been at, I think, actually. So that was in the Royal Irish Academy of Music, where we basically took advantage of it being easy to work with. It's not a particularly beautiful venue or anything, but by having the lights turned off, you get around that. We had total scope to do whatever we want in terms of bringing tables and so on into it, and in fact dressing up the whole venue rather than just the auditorium. And so because of that, essentially the access we had to the academy meant that venue was far more practical for us to use than anywhere else, where we probably would have faced astronomical costs to try and have not just a room but a whole venue, and also a very late start time, etc., etc. And so in that way, the piece that I wrote for that, certainly I knew what venue it was going to be, and I built it into the piece really. But that would be unusual. And in fact, most of the time when I put on concerts in edgy venues, either with Kirkos or with the Irish Composers Collective or for Shambles and Fonia, it's simply because there aren't any unedgy venues which are basically both available and good. And I think what has happened is that we've found that audiences, particularly young audiences who may be approaching it from not necessarily a classical background, are just much more interested in venues like that than they were in the Kevin Barry room.
Venues aren't neutral. I was thinking about St. Mark's in Venice, the architectural peculiarities of which induced composers like the Gabrielis to write music from many different choirs, echoing one another. And one of the results of this was that the tradition of linear counterpoint of the Renaissance gradually became dissolved into a different kind of block writing, and that prepared the way for the Baroque. Now, obviously it wasn't the only factor, but the venue in question had this effect. I was at a concert by the Arditi String Quartet in a church in a place called Tasco in Mexico. It was during the ISCN World Music Days. And they prepared a very quiet, concentrated program, I think Feldman and I don't know what else. But it turned out that the church was entirely inhabited by pigeons. I mean, there were literally thousands of pigeons in the goddamn place, and they kept cooing and flapping the whole time. I think they were shitting as well. So the Arditis changed their program to a very loud program to drown out the goddamn pigeons. So to what extent are composers going to be writing music for edgy venues in which they're drowning out the pigeons? You know, to what extent is a certain kind of music going to be written? I think it's being written. I think a lot of it is being written in the United States, and a lot of Americanism is unfortunately becoming very prevalent in this country. I think a lot of that is in response to this pressure to produce a kind of music that no longer requires attention but actually demands inattention. And I think that is socially regressive as well as being musically problematic. I believe it's rather inward-looking to assume that the alienation of the public from concert life is explicable exclusively by reference to purely musical criteria, composers indifferent to the needs of the public and all that, rather than to broader social and political developments. In this country in particular, the deficiencies of music education at a primary level remain scandalous, and they're not much better at a secondary level, and they're getting worse. Now, how do you deal with the music education system? You have to start root and branch. and it's part of the overall education system. How do you deal with the overall education system? And you're getting into really deep water. You're going to have a total change of politics. You're going to have to get those people out of Leinster House. You're going to have to change the system. You're going to have to become political activists and do your music on the side. There's also the factor of the peculiar history of music in this country that has to be taken, of what we call classical music, and its absence of a tradition and the extraordinary cultural cringe that has resulted from that. So, for example, we have a director of the Wexford Festival, the Wexford Opera Festival. I read an interview with him today that he gave in 2005, in which he said, you know, it's an amazing thing that in Wexford they kick up a row about whether we employ Irish musicians or not. In Canada, he was previously in Vancouver, in Canada they're not bothered about performers, but arts councils are really obsessed with Canadian music. He said the Canadian Arts Council wouldn't put up with that in relation to Canadian music. Why does the Irish Arts Council put up with that in relation to Irish music? Why are we not out there shouting about these things?
In Sebastian's own experience, he said that audience have proved more interested in these alternative venues. So are we reaching audiences? Is the concert hall the best place to make them feel welcome? Are composers, in short, still relevant to the lifestyles and the listening habits of today?
I kind of grit my teeth when I hear the word relevant, because, you know, you have a question here, is their music still making relevant contributions to our culture? But our culture in this country is partly defined by the fact that music, classical music, has never been relevant to it, except on the most superficial, the most drawing room level. And that is why it is possible to have a Festival of Irish Culture in Virginia a few years ago in the United States, organised by Fintan O'Toole, in which there was not a single piece of Irish music other than traditional music. This is why it is possible a decade ago for Cambridge to publish the Cambridge Companion to Irish Culture, with an apology into the introduction that there was nothing about classical music because it wasn't really an aspect of our culture. You know? That's what we're dealing with. So to talk about music, whether it is still relevant, we have to make it relevant. We have to do that by being activists. And we are now in a period of intense regression, and not to recognize that, and not to recognize that we need to be very activist, I think is burying our head in the sand.